Unintended Consequences by John Ross. Part 1 Seeds. December 11th, 1906. The two and a quarter inch pine cube spun in the air and a cheer went up from the crowd as the wood block bounced in the dirt. There was a gray ringed hole through the center of it. "That's the last one, Top," one of the men said unnecessarily. 50,000 with only 4 misses. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't been here. The lean mustachioed rifleman with the broad brimmed black hat lowered his gun to waist level. It was a Winchester model 1903, a semi automatic rifle introduced 3 years before. It held 10 rounds of 22 auto, a new rimfire cartridge loaded with the recently developed smokeless powder. Ammunition loaded with black powder, such as many existing stocks of 22 long, would foul auto-loading weapons in short order. The man withdrew the magazine's tube from the rifle's buttstock and dumped the 5 remaining rounds into his hand, then worked the action and ejected the round that was in the chamber. He handed the empty rifle to one of his loaders, who was already holding a second model 1903. Adolf Topperwein held the world's longest run record for percentage shooting of aerial targets with a rifle. The rules regarding the sport had been laid out by the exhibition shooter Doc Carver 3 decades before. Targets were to be wooden cubes or clay balls not more than 2.5 inches across and were to be thrown vertically 20 to 30 feet in the air by a person standing not less than 25 feet from the shooter. Other long-run shooters had shot at 50,000 targets, but they all had missed more often. The previous record holder had missed 280 targets out of 60,000. The young thrower bent over and picked up the final block. Instead of tossing it onto the pile with the others, he walked over to Topperwein and handed it to him. Top reached out gingerly and took it from the boy. His arm and back muscles were screaming in protest from being made to throw a rifle to his shoulder once every 4 seconds, 8 straight hours a day for a full week. It was an effort for him just to remain standing. Ad Topperwein examined the piece of wood, noting that he had hit it almost dead center, then looked over at the mound of blocks he had shot in the past week. The pile was 8 feet high and over 30 feet in diameter. He tried to massage his arm muscles, but his own fingers had no strength. "You ready for a hot bath and a soft bed?" Ad's wife Plinky asked. "Or can I get you some lunch first?" Plinky Topperwein was also an exhibition shooter for Winchester. The company had hired her after she had set a world trap shooting record in 1904 at the St. Louis World's Fair. "Not just yet, hon," he said to his wife. "If it's not too hard for you, Mr. Topperwein, we'd like to see you sit on top of the pile of blocks for a picture." This was San Antonio State Fair's photographer speaking. Topperwein gave a slight grin. "Sure, I can climb up there. May take a little longer than normal, that's all." He turned to one of his loaders. "We've got use of fairgrounds and the assistants paid for another 3.5 days, Ed. Seems a shame to waste it." He narrowed his eyes. "Cap Bartlett shot 60,000 back in '89. Top nodded at the huge pile of wood cubes. "Have the kids go through and pull out the ones that aren't split in two. I want to keep going." His loader's jaw dropped in astonishment. "And get hold of the Winchester rep. Tell him we're going to need more ammo by tomorrow afternoon. 6 cases just to be on the safe side." He pitched the 50,000th block underhanded onto the pile where it disappeared among the others. "I'm going to take about 20 minutes to cool off these arms and get a sandwich. Let's get going again about 1:30. He turned to the photographer. "Just before I start shooting again, I'll climb up there for your picture. Pile isn't going to get any bigger, but no awards or any of that stuff. I got a few more good shots in me. Let's see where we end up." He turned and started back towards his trailer, leaving the knot of helpers and spectators standing there speechless. When the San Antonio Fairgrounds closed on December 15th, 1906, Ad Topperwein, using 3 semi-auto Winchester 1903 rifles, had shot at 72,500 wooden blocks thrown in the air. He had missed 9. More than a half-century later, another man employed by Remington would hit over 100,000. His throwers, however, would stand by his left shoulder and gently toss the block straight out along the same path that the bullet would take. Top's record, shot under the rules laid out by another man in the 19th century, would never be broken. In 1906, skilled riflemen were universally admired, and people like Ad and Plinky Topperwein spent much of their time urging young boys and girls to learn gun safety and hone their shooting skills. The phrase did not exist in 1906 when Top set his record, for a special term was unnecessary. But years later, the fact would be evident. Ad Topperwein and his wife Plinky were part of the gun culture. May 10th, 1918. "Matt, I know I've been dealing with these government people, for 30 years, but I tell you, I will never get used to it. I had the water-cooled gun finished almost 20 years ago and offered it to them for next to nothing. They didn't show a lick of interest until after our country joined the war. It's not as if they didn't have any advance warning. Germany has a 250,000 8mm Maxims up and running. A gust of wind threatened to blow John Browning's hat off. He pushed it farther down on his head, then went on. What did we have when we entered this war? Less than 200 of my old air-cooled 95 Colts, a few hundred of those French things, and less than 300 Colt 1904 Maxim guns. Every one of those weapons is an entirely different design, and not one was originally designed to use the current issue .30 caliber round. John Browning knew he was repeating himself, but he couldn't help it. He also knew his brother would let him go on as long as he liked. I had the model 1901 water-cooled medium machine gun ready to go almost 2 decades ago, he thought. The government showed a complete lack of interest in it. What was particularly maddening to John Browning was that he was not some stranger the government had never heard of. Browning was the man who had made the country's first gas-operated machine gun in 1889, had demonstrated for the Navy in 1891 a machine gun which fired 1,800 rounds in 3 minutes without a single stoppage, and who had designed the first machine gun ever used by the U.S. military, the Model 1895 Colt Potato Digger machine gun, adopted by the U.S. Army in that year. In 1900, 3/4 of the sporting arms made in the U.S. were Browning designs. With sidearms, it was Browning's Model 1911 .45 automatic that the government had adopted when .38 caliber Army revolvers had failed to stop the crazed Moro warriors during the Philippine insurrections in 1898. So last year, John went on, with the country on the brink of war, the War Department finally realizes that U.S. soldiers armed with handguns and bolt-action rifles are going to face hundreds of thousands of Maxim machine guns already in use by the German Army. John Browning shook his head. He did not say it, but he was thinking of the great irony of this. Here in Maxim, an inventive genius, the equal of John Browning, was an American. Maximum, however, had no prior designs which had been adopted by the U.S. Armed Forces, and he had taken his inventions to Europe, where their value had been immediately appreciated. Now hundreds of thousands of American soldiers would face these lethally efficient weapons, designed by an American but manufactured by 7 German arsenals and issued to German troops. I have serious doubts about this idea of walking fire, John said to his brother, but my gun will do all right. You got it done faster than he said you would, too, Matt said. The U.S. government had implored John Browning to design an automatic rifle that could be carried by one man and fired with full control from the hip on full automatic. It was the expert's theory that a line of soldiers equipped with such weapons could sweep an area clean. Browning had obliged with the 17-pound Browning automatic rifle, whose design had been finalized 3 short months after the government's initial request. John and his brother Matt were now on their way from New Haven to the Winchester firing facility on the waterfront bordering Long Island Sound. The Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, was just now going into production, and the inventor had been asked to present at an official demonstration for military observers. As the 2 men walked towards the firing range, John Browning continued the largely one-sided conversation with his brother. Now that they finally got the gun into production, just about in time for the end of the war, they want us up here to watch them shoot it. What use that's going to do, I have no idea. Despite his grousing, John Browning loved military demonstrations of his designs and was secretly glad to be going to another one. His weapons always delivered more than the authorities expected. At the official demonstration of the Browning Model 1917 water-cooled belt-fed machine gun in May of that year, the weapon had digested 40,000 rounds of ammunition without missing a beat. It had finally succumbed to the malfunction most common to John Browning's designs. It ran out of ammo. I wish to heaven the bar could have been in our soldiers' hands this time last year. I looked at that French show shot they've been trying to make do with. It's a disaster. I'd be afraid to fire it. Val says in the 79th they plug the bore and fire them with a string to blow them up, so no one will use them in combat. Matt Browning was referring to his nephew John's son, who was currently stationed in France. The family received letters from him regularly. Let's hope Uncle Sam sends the first batch of bars to his division. They ought to with the deal you agreed to. John Browning had sold the rights to the bar for $750,000 outright. Under standard military contract terms, Browning would have ultimately received 20 times that amount in royalties. The first shipment of bars would, however, go to Val Browning's division, the 79th, in July of 1918. Don't begrudge them our agreement, Matt. I'm 62 years old. I wouldn't live long enough to see much more in royalties than they already gave me. And as for the family, the royalties for the auto shotgun will pull more from the civilian market than my children could spend in a dozen lifetimes. Well, I think you're right about that. Matt Browning smiled at the memory of his brother's refusal to sell the patent for the Auto 5 outright. Up until 1902, every Browning design had been sold for cash to either Winchester or the U.S. government. Because of John Browning, Winchester had a lock on the sporting arms market. With the auto shotgun, John had demanded a royalty contract and Winchester had refused. It was one of the costliest mistakes that company would ever make. Fabrique Nationale in Belgium had agreed to Browning's terms, starting a mutually profitable relationship that would endure until the designer's death in 1926 at the age of 71. In 1918, FN was producing the Auto 5 shotgun and several Browning-designed automatic pocket pistols. The firm would come to manufacture John Browning's superposed shotgun, his 14-shot 9mm P35 high-power pistol, a fine pump-action .22 rifle, and eventually several refinements of the bar that the inventor and his brother were about to see demonstrated. So what do they have planned for this little get-together? Matt asked his older sibling. Undoubtedly the standard routine. Reliability demonstration, show of controllability, ease of handling. John said these words without rancor. Although such events had become commonplace, it still pleased the inventor a great deal to see in operation the weapon he had designed. I'd also be amazed if they don't have some guy who's been practicing blindfolded stripping and reassembling the thing. Ever since I showed them that trick, they've been talking about it. I think the Army's apt to make it part of their training with all their weapons. John Browning was right about the blindfold demonstration and about the coming decision to make it part of basic training. He was right about reliability and controllability before being the standard elements of the exhibition. Browning was asked to be part of the demonstration, as had been his custom with earlier sessions involving other Browning designs. This, as always, pleased the inventor. What John Browning did not know was that the people in charge had prepared an additional element as part of the afternoon's coming activities. "Gentlemen," the Winchester representative said to the spectators assembled near the shore of the Atlantic Ocean, "you have all seen the reliability, power, and controllability of the new Browning automatic rifle. It gives the infantryman effectiveness he has heretofore only dreamed about. Production is underway, and in a matter of weeks the first shipments of these guns will be in the hands of some of our troops." He paused to let this information sink in before continuing. "Many of you may assume that this weapon is of necessity much more cumbersome to handle than the Krag or Springfield, and that as a machine rifle is of little use firing single shots. That is not true, as you will now see." As the Winchester rep said the words, John Browning watched a slender man of about 45 with a mustache step up to the firing line. Strong gusts of wind were blowing in from offshore, and the man removed his hat and laid it on the table, weighting down the brim with 2 loaded magazines. "This is Ad Topperwine, who works for us. He's going to give a little demonstration of just how manageable this rifle is on single fire. I'll let him tell you what he's going to do." The factory rep stepped aside and took a seat. Topperwine held up some steel discs for the audience to see and then addressed the crowd. "It's very windy today, and we need a target that won't blow around so much. The fellows in the machine shop had some 1.5-inch steel rod, and I asked them to chuck it up to in the lathe and cut off some 1/4-inch thick sections." He held one of the steel discs edgewise for the audience to view. "They shouldn't move around too much in the wind," he explained. "What's this fellow think he's going to do with them?" John Brown whispered to his brother. "Shoot them out of the air with a 17-pound machine rifle that fires from an open bolt?" It soon became apparent that that was exactly what Ad Topperwine intended to do. The audience watched with rapt attention as an assistant took a stack of the heavy steel discs and stepped 7 or 8 paces away from Topperwine towards the ocean. Top picked up one of the bars that had just been used in the endurance demonstration, pulled back the bolt, and inserted a loaded 20-round magazine. He held the weapon at waist level. "All 20 face on. Throw the next one as soon as you hear the shot," Topperwine instructed his thrower. The man nodded and tossed the first disc 20 feet into the air, spinning it like a phonograph record so that it did not tumble. Top threw the bar to his shoulder, and the gun fired as the disc neared the apex of its ascent. Immediately, the thrower sent another disc aloft. In less than 30 seconds, Top had fired 20 shots. The audience had strained to watch the discs move or to hear the impact of the bullets on them. It appeared that some of them had wobbled, but the muzzle blast of the weapon drowned out any noise of bullet impacting steel. "I think he hit a couple of them," John Browning said to his brother, with genuine admiration in his voice. At 62, John Browning averaged 95% a trap, and he could not imagine hitting a single one of the steel discs using a machine rifle firing from an open bolt. The audience watched the thrower walk around and pick up the 20 steel discs that lay on the ground. When they brought them over to their group for their inspection, John Browning drew his breath in abruptly. All 20 discs had 3/8 inch holes in them, very near the center in each case. The metal had flowed back in a lip around the circumference of each hole, as is typical when a high-velocity bullet meets mild steel, and each hole was washed with silvery metal from the cupronickel jacket of the .30 caliber bullet. The current issue round is a 172 grain bullet, but I'm shooting up some old stock with the 150 grain slug. What the soldiers are getting now is much better at long range, but the 150 is faster up close, and it's a lot faster than the old Craig load, Top explained. It goes through quarter-inch mild steel without giving much notice. He removed the empty magazine from the gun and replaced it with a full one. "Put 'em all up again, same way, only edgewise this time," he instructed his thrower. "Stand a couple steps closer, this gets a little harder." The man scaled the first disc upwards with its edge to topper wine in the crowd, and Top threw the bar to his shoulder. This time, when the gun fired, the blast was followed by a howling noise as the disc was driven spinning far out over the ocean. The thrower immediately scaled the next one into the air with identical results. In a short time, 18 of the steel discs had been sent screaming out over the water, hit on the edge by one of the targets. He put the bar back on the table and went to pick up the 2 discs he had missed. At Topperwine examined them, turned to the awestruck crowd. "I don't have much experience with machine guns," he allowed, "but the bar is one of the smoothest operating rifles I've ever fired. I think all of us should thank Mr. Browning here, not only for this superb rifle, but for all of the fine weapons he's put in the hands of our servicemen." John Browning said nothing. He was still thinking about what he had just witnessed. John Browning was also part of the gun culture. April 18th, 1919. Back home at last, the 20-year-old soldier thought with a smile as he stretched his arms and legs. Lieutenant Cameron Wilcox Bowman listened as the brakes squealed and the train slowed to a crawl. A blast of steam was released from the boiler, and the locomotive slowly pulled the railroad cars into the station in Kansas City. "Cam!" his brother Michael yelled in greeting from the platform. "I didn't even recognize you. Lord, is that gray hair you're getting?" the soldier said as he stepped onto the platform and looked his brother over. "Now, how did that happen?" Mike was 10 years older than his brother Cam. He was not getting gray hair. "How's the baby?" was the next thing Cameron asked. Mike's wife had given birth to a son just before the U.S. had entered the war. Cam suddenly looked horrified. "Flu didn't get him, did it?" "No, we missed that, thank God. But he's not much of a baby anymore. He's almost 2 years old and running around everywhere. Wait till you see him. You're going to just die." "What on earth do you have in here?" Michael Bowman demanded. They had located Cam's bags and were muscling them out of the freight section. "Oh, I just brought you back a few things," the lieutenant said. "Like what, the anchor from your troop ship? This thing weighs a ton." "Picked up some guns and brought 'em back with me. Jerry's didn't need 'em anymore. Brought you a Luger. Also got a .45 auto I'd like you to have. Not many of the troops got 'em in time, but my unit was led by the son of the guy designed it, so I got one. Got a bar, too, if you can believe that. Thought maybe they'd squawk when I stuck it in my bag, 'cause they're so new. Figured I'd give it up if anyone asked. Nobody said a word, though." "Lord, they better not have," Michael said immediately. "You earned it, I'd say. Now, what's in here?" He judged that the bag must have weighed 100 pounds. "Got a Maxim and a Schwarzschild in that one." He glanced around the station platform. "Let's see if we can find a wagon or a cart or something." Michael Bowman grinned and shook his head. "It's not too far to the truck. Come on, we got lots of time." At train stations all across the country, similar scenes were being played out as servicemen happily returned home. Most of them, like Cam Bowman, brought both domestic and foreign ordnance back with them in their belongings. U.S. service weapons were technically considered government property, but by the end of the war, many soldiers felt they had earned the right to keep the arms they had carried through the mud, while bullets flew around them. Few combat veterans in positions of authority disagreed with this attitude. In addition to issue arms, virtually every soldier who had served overseas had, like Cam Bowman, brought home captured foreign weapons. Mauser and Luger semi-automatic pistols were universally admired for their workmanship, accuracy, and rapid delivery of shots. They also had detachable shoulder stocks the German craftsmen had designed for them, so that they could be converted into short, light, medium-range carbines. It was a rare doughboy who had returned to the States without at least one of these handsome weapons in his duffel bags. The stock for the Mauser pistol doubled as the weapon's holster. The one Bowman had liberated had been peppered with the same shrapnel that had killed its former owner. The stock was perforated in 3 places, and the magazine, well of the gun itself, had a dime-sized gouge in it. Looking at the gun was a reminder of what often happened to soldiers in combat. Mauser bolt-action rifles were quite common war trophies, and a few soldiers even brought back the huge 45-pound, 56 caliber Mauser anti-tank rifle to impress the folks back home. Cam Bowman had one of the massive weapons, but had lost it in a shipboard poker game on the voyage home. Most highly prized of all, though sometimes awkward to transport, were the fully automatic machine guns brought back from France and Germany. The little 9-pound German MP-18 Schmeisser that was wrapped in Cam Bowman's trousers inside his duffel bag fired the same 9mm pistol cartridge as the Uzi and Heckler & Koch submachine guns that would be used by the U.S. Secret Service half a century later. These later arms, however, would be made of steel stampings and molded plastic, and would not exhibit the fine finish or machining of the 1918 weapon. The German Maxim and Austrian Schwarzlose that Cam Bowman had liberated were large belt-fed water-cooled machine guns, fired from bipod and tripod respectively. The Maximum was the better of the two, and this was evidenced by the fact that Hiram Maxim's basic 1884 design would still be in use by major world powers such as Great Britain up until 1962. As the Bowman brothers lugged the heavy cases out to their vehicle, other soldiers from the train poked through the piles of baggage to find their own belongings. Almost every serviceman's bag contained at least one war trophy that the young man intended to hang over the mantel, shoot on weekends, or give to a friend. Of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers returning home, not one of them could have imagined that in the future, citizens like themselves would be judged unfit to possess the very arms that they had used to defend their country. July 16th, 1932. Take it from me, this is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had. Pure Americanism. Willing to take this beating as you've taken it, stand right steady, you keep every law. And why in the hell shouldn't you? Who in the hell has done all the bleeding for this country? And this law, and this Constitution anyhow? But you fellows. General Smedley Butler, U.S. Marine Corps retired, ripped his fist through the air to emphasize his last point and paused to take a breath before continuing. A roar of applause from several thousand men split the hot summer afternoon, and Cam Bowman felt the hair on his arms stand up. General Butler's words were lifting Bowman's spirits in a way he would not have thought possible 12 hours earlier. The slender, sinewy, retired officer stared at the 14,000 veterans of the Great War and prepared to continue. He had an angular, hawk-like face, and everyone except those in the very back could see the burning intensity in the man's eyes as he spoke. Butler wore rumpled civilian clothing, twill trousers with suspenders, a colorful tie, and a white dress shirt with the sleeves halfway rolled up. His bushy eyebrows danced as he went on with his speech. But don't take a step back. Remember that as soon as you haul down your camp flag here and clear out of this thing, every one of you clears out. This evaporates in thin air, and all this struggle will have been no good. All around him, Cam Bowman could see veterans nodding at the general's words. He found he was standing straight, as if at attention. I've come 1,000 miles and camped here on the mud flats for almost 2 months, he told himself. I'm not going to give up yet. Cameron Wilcox Bowman was a veteran, and like all U.S. veterans of the Great War, he had been promised a bonus by the U.S. government. The bonus was $1 for every day of active service in the U.S. during the war, and $1.50 for every day of service overseas, payable in 1945. The total payment due in that year was over $3 billion. 1932 had been the worst year yet of the Great Depression, and many veterans realized they might well be dead by 1945. The situation was especially grim for those from farming communities. The typical farm in the first part of the century was 160 acres, which, not coincidentally, was the amount of land allotted by the Homestead Act of 1862. These farms, for the most part, were self-sufficient and produced a modest surplus that their owners sold. In the late 1920s, however, many farmers began assuming large amounts of debt from ill-advised expansion when the disastrous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 brought U.S. tariffs to an all-time high. Soaring debt and plummeting demand for what they produced was a devastating combination for farmers, and the situation was exacerbated by the drought that swept the Midwest. Thousands of farms were driven into bankruptcy, and starvation loomed for the many families. In the spring, a young veteran from Oregon, Walter H. Waters, had led a group of 300 veterans across the country to peacefully assemble in Washington. There, the Bonus Expeditionary Force, as they called themselves, hoped to persuade Congress to authorize immediate payment of the bonus money that they so desperately needed. Cam Bowman had lost his farm in Missouri the previous year. He had joined Waters' group and been among the first 2,000 veterans to arrive in the nation's capital. The veterans had set up living quarters in several abandoned buildings on Pennsylvania Avenue, but as hundreds of World War veterans poured into the capital daily, much more space was needed. In response, Washington police cleared a patch of ground on the mud flats near the town of Anacostia, on the other side of the Anacostia River from the city of Washington. The location suited the administration, for the veterans were separated from the city by the river, and any who wanted to assemble in the city had to cross the bridge and complete a substantial march first. It was here that Cam Bowman and other veterans camped in makeshift dwellings made of cardboard, sheet tin, and scrap lumber. By mid-June, over 10,000 veterans were living on the flats in what would become the nation's largest and most famous Hooverville. In addition to these men were several hundred wives and children that had come with them. On June 15, 1932, the House of Representatives voted to authorize early payment of the veterans' bonus. 2 days later, the Senate took up the bill and overwhelmingly killed it. The bonus marchers were stunned. In the weeks that ensued, veterans continued to pour in from around the country, and the ranks of the bonus marchers swelled to over 20,000 veterans. Legislators left the Capitol and otherwise ducked the issue. Senator Connolly's proposal to pay the veterans the present value of their 1945 bonus lost 11-4. Senator Thomas of Oklahoma, whose constituents were especially destitute, proposed that monies be paid early to those veterans who could present proof of absolute want. Thomas's notion met with a similar fate. In mid-July, Congress adjourned without any further action on the issue. The Bonus Army stayed, hoping for a miracle. There were three remarkable things about the Bonus Army's 20,000-person assembly on the Anacostia Flats. The first was that while Washington, D.C. and each branch of the armed forces were themselves strictly segregated, the Bonus Army was not. White and Negro veterans and their families lived side by side in makeshift hovels on the flats, and the New York Times published an article entitled, "The Bonus-Ears Banned Jim Crow." The second remarkable thing was that the veterans of the Bonus Army, by universal agreement, were completely unarmed. No member of the Bonus Expeditionary Force had brought anything more lethal than a penknife to Washington. This was not for lack of ability. Virtually every veteran after the end of the war owned at least one military-issue firearm, and most, like Cam Bowman, owned several, including machine guns. Some had sold their guns, but war trophies were worth next to nothing when people needed every dollar for food. Most of the veterans' weapons sat in attics of friends and relatives who were still able to make mortgage payments, and the array of armament that the veterans did not bring to D.C. was startling. The third remarkable thing was that no legislator had proposed the obvious solution, which would have solved the problem without increasing the government's financial obligation by a single dollar or altering its schedule of payments in any way. Now, in spite of the adjournment, General Butler was urging the veterans to keep the faith and stay camped on the flats. Cam Bowman looked at the other men around him. I guess Butler thinks maybe a miracle will happen, he thought. I've come this far. I'll see it through to the end. Cam Bowman did not know that the government had its own agenda concerning the bonus army. Cam Bowman had less than 3 weeks to live. July 28th, 1932. Jesus Christ, they're coming to kill us all, thought Cam Bowman as shouts of alarm rose through the group. The veterans had been silently shuffling around the Capitol in what had come to be known as the Death March. It was an eerie thing to watch. Earlier, soldiers had thrown tear gas canisters at the bonus marchers. The veterans who were destitute but had not forgotten their training easily tossed them back. Tear gas was nothing for a soldier to get excited about. What was coming next was another matter. When the veterans saw what was approaching them now, many were wrenched back into the horror they had experienced 15 years before. Advancing towards the unarmed marchers were scores of soldiers equipped with gas masks and carrying rifles at port arms with bayonets fixed. Behind the foot soldiers rode cavalry soldiers with sabers drawn. Behind the horse soldiers rolled a number of whippet tanks. It was the tanks that did it. Some of the bonus marchers who had been inspired by General Butler's words and who had stood firm even after Congress had adjourned now turned and ran. They ran out of the Capitol, heading for the bridge that crossed the Anacostia River and the safety of the camp. Lieutenant Cameron Wilcox Bowman stood his ground and waited as the cavalry approached. A mounted soldier singled him out, and Bowman stared him straight in the eyes as the soldier, 10 years his junior, drew back his saber. Bowman refused to believe that this man, a fellow officer in the U.S. Army, was going to kill him. He was determined not to flinch, no matter what the horse soldier did. As the blade of the saber sliced through the air, however, Lieutenant Bowman's instincts overrode his brain, and he reflexively threw his left arm up to prevent the blade from decapitating him. The soldiers had been instructed by their commander to clear the bonus marchers out of the area by striking them with the flats of their sabers' blades, not the cutting edge, and this is what the cavalrymen did. It was like being struck by a 3-foot steel bar, and Lieutenant Cameron Bowman's left wrist was shattered like kindling. He did not cry or fall down, but when Bowman saw the soldier prepared to deliver a second blow, he finally accepted his fate and gave ground. As he made his way towards the bridge, his ruined wrist began to scream in agony. Bowman saw 3 men leading the Army troops and was stunned by what he saw. He did not recognize the 2 Army majors who would later come to prominence. The man in charge of leading the infantrymen, cavalry, and tank division, however, was impossible to miss. The lesser-ranked officers were Major George S. Patton and Major Dwight D. Eisenhower. The senior officer was Chief of Staff of the U.S. Armed Forces, General Douglas MacArthur. Cam Bowman huddled on his filthy blanket. His body was drenched in sweat. He had wrapped a dirty scrap of cloth around his damaged wrist, but one of the bones was poking through the skin, and the rag was soaked with blood. All around him, people were running, and he wasn't always sure if the screams he was hearing were those of others or if they were his own. It was almost midnight, and though he knew he was delirious, the screaming intensified, and there was a distinct smell. It isn't my imagination. Tear gas, of course, but also, oh no, wood smoke. He squeezed his eyes shut and willed it to be May again, willed it to be a dream, willed this all to be anything but the true horror that he knew was coming. Oh, sweet Jesus, Lieutenant Cameron Bowman softly said aloud. His voice was a cracked whisper of utter despair. General MacArthur's burning us out. May 10th, 1936. Are you sure this is really what you want, Sophia? The middle-aged woman's eyes showed great sadness as she looked at her middle daughter. An American? I am sure he is a fine man, but you cannot speak a word of English. And to go to live in New York? Her voice trailed off and she squeezed her hands together, ignoring the arthritis in her fingers. You had no such fears when I went to London, Mother. English is the language of that country as well, and I will learn it in time. I was fine in London. Does this surprise you so that I would meet my future husband there? But an American, Sophia? Her mother pleaded. And he is 4 years younger than you. To live in New York, where there are so many other, she searched for the greatest or the gentlest phrase, and finally said American women, and trailed off without elaborating further. The sound of defeat was plain in her voice. Her daughter jumped to her feet. You think I won't be good enough for him. You think he must be crazy to want to marry an old Polish woman, and in a little while he will come to his senses and run off with an American girl who deserves him. Is that what you think? Sophia Schiffbach's nostrils were flared, and her voice shook with outrage. She was practically screaming, and it was because her mother had touched on the one thing that absolutely terrified the young woman. Why had Maxwell Collins asked her to marry him? Was it on impulse? Would he soon regret it? These questions had kept her awake for long hours every night since his proposal 3 weeks before. Sophia was 27, which was hardly dried up, but she was definitely older than most single women she knew. When Max had noticed her and asked her to dance that first night in the London nightclub, she realized he was the most exciting man she had ever seen in her entire life. His presence was absolutely overwhelming to both men and women. She had made him understand that she did not speak English. He had nodded, even though her friend Kirsten, who was fluent in both languages, he had told her that in 1 week he would be able to speak Polish. And he had. From the moment he had said, "Is this good enough, or should I go back to the book before I ask you out again?" in her native tongue, she had been smitten. And she knew, though she tried not to think about it, that she was not the first woman who had ever been smitten by this man, and would not be the last. She was, however, the one he had asked to marry him. She was not going to turn that chance down. She took a deep breath before she spoke again. When she did, her tone was soft and understanding. "I know you are worried, Mother. I understand that. I am sorry that you fear what may happen to us. But I think you know that my mind is made up. Will you not give both of us your love and blessing and wish us well?" The older woman's eyes filled with tears. "Of course I will, Kokani. How could I do anything else?" She embraced her daughter and pulled the girl's face close to her own. "Go with God." Magna Schuspach had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room as her older sister and her mother talked of the pending marriage. At 17, Magda was the baby of the family, and she was absolutely thrilled at her mother's final acceptance of her older sister's romance with the American. The teenager's excitement was not because of a special bond she shared with her older sibling, for the 10-year age difference had prevented them from being together to any great extent as Magda had grown up. Her excitement was also not because of any romantic ideas she might have conjured up about a man she had never met. Magna Schuspach had something much larger at stake here, and of considerably more personal interest. Magna Schuspach had a boyfriend, and she had not told her mother about him. He was not Polish, he was German, and she had met him 2 months before in Danzig. Erwin Mann, at 19, was the handsomest, kindest, most thrilling young man that Magna had ever met, and she was sure that she would marry him. Magda jumped over and ran over to kiss her sister. Sophia thought it was in congratulation of her coming wedding. In reality, it was the little sister thanking Sophia for breaking the ground for her own startling news that would arrive in due time. In several weeks, Sophia would sail for New York and would soon be living in a small apartment with her new husband. She would spend the rest of her long life in the United States. Her own fears and those of her mother would prove to be well-founded. Max Collins was a decent man, and the fact that his wife was Polish and would never speak English terribly well would not be the cause of Sophia's heartache. The problem, as Sophia had feared, was that the people were drawn to Max Collins, and when those people happened to be women, he responded to them, and his getting married did not change that fact. Magna Schuspach would marry Erwin Mann the following year and help him operate a small grocery store in Danzig. Erwin would remain utterly devoted to his wife and she to him. Throughout her life, Sophia would always wish that her own marriage could have been more like she envisioned her little sister's. Yet in later years, Sophia would also never forget that Maxwell Collins gave her something that ultimately was worth more than everything else that the rest of her family possessed. Max had brought her to America. Zofia would be living in comfort in the U.S., a well nourished and with a sharp mind, when every one of her blood relatives had been dead for over 50 years. For the boy that her sister Magna had met and would marry that fall was not only a German, Erwin Mann was also a Jew. June 22nd, 1938. The Treasury agent did not like being in the woods. Anderson always thought of an Indian moving silently among the twigs, leaves, and other natural detritus, and his own clumsy efforts at stealth came up woefully short of this imagined standard. The agent much preferred to enforce the law back in Little Rock, where there were paved streets to drive on with real maps and road signs to tell you where you were, warehouses with real addresses when you had to bust in somewhere, and snitches to let you know what to expect when you got to where the bad guys were. That had been the environment in which he had operated for 9 years, and it had suited him well. He had racked up an extensive arrest record, and he had been quite proud of it. All that had changed 5 years ago. No more following midnight deliveries made by drab vehicles with bogus furniture company lettering on the sides. Now the drivers for Anheuser-Busch drove big red trucks with the company logo on them, and they smiled at him when they pulled into town to make the delivery runs from St. Louis. He didn't disagree with the reasons for repeal. Anderson had seen from his very first day on the job that as long as there were people who wanted to drink liquor, there would always be other people to see to it that they could buy whatever booze they wanted. If buying liquor was illegal, that meant that the people providing it would not be mere businessmen, but businessmen that were willing to break the law as a basic necessary matter of business policy, and sometimes that meant killing people. Since repeal 5 years before, he had yet to hear of a licensed beer or liquor distributor getting into a gun battle with a competitor. Anderson's displeasure with the repeal of prohibition was purely selfish in nature, and he did not try to tell himself otherwise. I had it good for 9 years. I could blend in when I went out on a case. I knew what was waiting for me when I went through a door. I knew who would pay off and who had to go down. And the guys we were after were making so much dough that they knew it was a minor setback and that their lawyers would get them sprung. Just part of the cost of doing business. The man squinted and looked over to where his partner was standing behind a tree, studying a topographical map. Now I'm stuck here, God knows where, chasing after illiterate hillbillies so dirt poor that the only way they can get by is to cook up this stuff and sell it to people who can't afford the real thing because the government puts a big tax on it. And when one of them goes down, it may mean that his entire family is going to starve to death, so he might as well shoot me from behind a tree before I can make the collar. The Treasury agent took a few deep breaths. He did not like this at all. I'm banking only a third of what I was 5 years ago, with 10 times the risk of ending up in an unmarked grave out here in the middle of nowhere. Maybe I can get transferred to counterfeiting detail, he thought for perhaps the 100th time. He uttered an oath under his breath. Have you figured out where we are? The man asked his partner. Agent Turner glanced up from the map. He was new to the department and some 15 years younger than his companion. Since he had arrived at Treasury well after the repeal of Prohibition, Agent Turner did not have the basis for comparison that his partner did, and so did not view this job with the same loathing. Agent Turner had also not felt the lure of bribes, payoffs, and untraceable money that are also present wherever lucrative criminal enterprises exist. Agent Turner at that moment was concentrating on the job at hand. We need to go up that valley about 400 yards, Turner said quietly, nodding his head to indicate the direction, and climb the hill on the right. It's flat on top, and there's supposed to be a small clearing where he's got his still. Anderson grunted in acknowledgement. He had heard the briefing about the equipment, about how the equipment was hidden on top of the hill. The department had leaned on some other wretched hillbilly, and he had ratted out his friend in the hopes of getting a reduced sentence. The road he uses comes up from the other side, Turner continued, and we should be out of sight until we're almost on top of him. If he's there, Turner added as an afterthought. If he's not there, then we'll damn well wait for the sorry bastard, Agent Anderson asserted. I'm not going to come out here and play Daniel Boone unless we go back with a collar. I'll lead, Turner offered as he started to walk methodically towards the valley. Kid knows I hate going first in the woods, Anderson thought with mild irritation. Agent Anderson said nothing as he fell in behind the younger man. He found his partner's upbeat attitude vaguely irritating. But he was happy to let Turner lead the way. Let the kid get his ass shot at first, Anderson thought sourly. It'll give me a chance to hear where this hillbilly is hiding in this fucking jungle. He instinctively ran his hand over the butt of his service revolver, a 38 caliber Smith & Wesson military and police model with 6-inch barrel that he carried under his coat. The older man looked bleakly at his partner's back. Agent Turner seemed to be covering ground without making much noise at all. Agent Anderson grimaced as his next step caused a twig to snap with an audible crack. He wished there were more than just the two of them. He wished he were sitting in the car they had left 2 miles away smoking a cigarette. Most of all, Agent Anderson wished he were back in his office in Little Rock, pouring himself a stiff jolt of Irish whiskey so he could forget about ever looking for ignorant inbred white trash and moonshiners. It took the 2 Treasury agents the better part of an hour to traverse the valley and climb the hill. They stopped regularly to get their bearings and try to spot any signs of human life, but there were none. The only creatures around them were the mosquitoes that they slapped away, and the unidentified insects that did not bother them but provided a constant backdrop of buzzing and chirping noises, which helped a little to muffle the sounds of their progress. At Agent Turner's insistence, they crawled the last 100 yards to the top of the hill. Squirming on his belly through dead leaves did nothing to improve Agent Anderson's outlook on the assignment. As they finally reached the last few yards before the summit, the 2 Treasury agents slowed their progress to where they were only moving an inch or two at a time. Suddenly Turner shoved his hand towards his partner, silently commanding him to stop moving and be still. He turned his head around slowly and whispered, "I can see the top of it. It's about 30 yards away. It's hidden in some trees, but I can see the cooling coils. Wait here." Turner crawled a few feet further to a spot where he could peer over a fallen log at the top of the hill. He turned to Anderson. "I don't see any sign of anybody," he whispered softly. "Come on up." Agent Anderson grunted and heaved himself to his feet. His partner tried to silently protest, but Anderson ignored him and walked up to where Agent Turner lay behind the log. He squatted next to the younger man and nodded. "Well, Daniel Boone? Looks like you got us to the right place." Agent Turner smiled at the rare compliment. "What do we do now? Go look over the setup?" The older man shook his head. "I don't want to leave any tracks that could scare our boy off when he comes here. For all I know, every son of a bitch that lives in these hills can tell at a glance if a mouse has walked by. Also, he may have a booby trap set." Turner nodded his agreement. The risk of being killed in the line of duty was universally accepted, but it was every agent's nightmare to be blinded or crippled by a criminal's efforts to protect his property. It didn't happen often, but it did happen, and both men knew it. "Let's find us a good spot to watch from and sit our asses down for a while. I'm sick of crawling around like a damned lizard." Agent Anderson brushed the dirt from his pants and looked around for a suitable spot to begin their vigil. "Over there," Turner said, looking at a large oak tree with a dead tree lying at the base of its trunk. "We can sit behind that log and still see where he'll have to drive up." Anderson considered the suggestion and nodded. The 2 men walked over behind the oak tree and the log and sat down. Without discussion, they faced slightly away from each other to afford themselves the ability to survey a wider area. Silently, they settled down to wait. Anderson was in a foul mood from the many mosquito bites he had suffered, and the fact that after 2 hours his bowels had demanded relief. There had been no alternative but to walk down the hill, find a log, and use leaves in place of the toilet paper he had neglected to bring. He had caught Turner grinning when he returned, and that hadn't helped his attitude at all. He was about to say something when the younger man held up his hand. "Listen." The 2 men heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle laboring in low gear, slowly making its way up the opposite side of the hill. Both agents were fully alert now, staying completely still and waiting for their quarry to come into sight. The old truck suddenly came into view, but about 70 yards away. Anderson and Turner followed its progress as it vanished and reappeared several times from their field of vision through the patchy foliage. There were 2 occupants. The truck stopped next to the group of trees that concealed the illegal still, 20 yards in front of the 2 agents. The driver backed the vehicle around until it was facing away from them and they could see the bed of the truck. It was empty. The door opened and a tired-looking man got out of the cab. He looked around absent-mindedly and trudged towards the clump of trees. He wore torn, faded overalls and had several days' growth of beard on his lined face. He was joined by the second man, who was a bit younger. Anderson and Turner heard rustling noises, then grunts of effort. In a few moments the men emerged from behind the trees. They each carried a heavy sack, and each man's body was bent under the burden. The first man was carefully stepping over a fallen log on his way to the truck when Anderson stood up. His back was to his partner, and he did not see the worried look on the younger man's face. Agent Turner had just realized that something was wrong with what he was seeing. Turner reached up to stop his partner, but it was too late. Agent Anderson was already running after the men with his gun drawn. "Freeze! Federal agents, you're under arrest!" Anderson bellowed as he broke into the clearing. The men with the sacks on their shoulders stopped dead and waited. Anderson stopped 15 feet from them with his gun held out in front of him in his right hand. "Turn around slowly. Don't move your hands or I'll put a big hole right in the middle of each of you." The men turned slowly to face their captors. "Are you Jack Miller?" Agent Anderson demanded of the man who had been driving the truck. The man nodded silently. "Put that sack down slowly and keep your hands where I can see them." Miller did as he was told. "Now you," he said to the second man, who also complied. "What's your name?" "Frank Layton," he said sullenly. Agent Turner was moving away from his partner over to where the still was hidden behind the clump of trees. He dreaded what he thought he would find there. "What's in the sack?" Agent Anderson demanded. Turner closed his eyes with dismay. He knew what Miller's answer would be. "Sugar," Miller said simply, as the younger Treasury agent had known he would. The young Treasury agent stood staring at what had once been an operating still. The copper condensing coil was still intact, but the boiler had been destroyed years ago, as was evidenced by the collection of rust on the big gashes that made it inoperable. Next to the ruined relic were some heavy tarpaulins. One of them was folded back to reveal several neatly stacked 100-pound bags of sugar. "There's no still here." "What?" Anderson yelled, forgetting this training and turning his head to look at where Turner was standing. Agent Turner walked over to his partner. "Still that's there hasn't been in operation for years. All they've got is some sugar stored under a tarp. Looks like our boy didn't give us the location of Miller's real still after all." Turner walked slowly over to Miller's battered truck while keeping a careful eye on its owner. Jack Miller's eyes narrowed and Anderson saw a tight, humorless smile across his face for a brief moment. Miller stayed where he was and said nothing to the city men in suits. Agent Anderson walked over to the ruined still. His face showed undisguised disgust and hatred. He shook his head in disbelief as he pulled back the tarp in the vain hope that there might be something illegal under it. More sacks of sugar, that's all. "Fuck," Anderson spat out the word. "It's no crime to have a shitload of sugar, even if all four of us know exactly what you two are going to do with it. Get your miserable asses out of here." Jack Miller and his companion turned towards the truck, but Agent Turner blocked their way. Turner was holding the shotgun that had been on the truck's passenger seat. Where'd you fellows come from?" the agent asked. Miller and Frank Layton stared at each other. Finally, Miller said, "Oklahoma." The agent held up the double-barreled shotgun. Miller licked his lips as realization set in. The man was going to kill them with Miller's own gun and leave them here. There wasn't a thing they could do about it. Then the agent smiled, opened the action to remove the two shells, and looked at Anderson. "Partner, we've got our collar. We're not going home empty-handed after all." Anderson shook his head. "It's no crime to have a shotgun in your truck, and I'll be damned if I'm going to lie and say these stupid hillbillies threatened me with it. I don't have the stomach for that kind of thing." "No, you're missing it. National Firearms Act, federal violation, passed in '34. Illegal possession and interstate transport of an unregistered shotgun with a barrel less than 18 inches long." Jack Miller, who normally knew enough not to speak to law enforcement agents, could not contain himself. "Illegal possession? Hell! That's my gun. Can't nobody say different. I've never stolen a thing in my life." This last was not entirely accurate, but it was true that Mr. Miller had indeed acquired the gun legally. Agent Anderson was looking even more bewildered than Jack Miller, though less outraged. "What the hell are you talking about?" "The National Firearms Act of 1934, passed in June of that year." He was grinning broadly now, playing to his audience. "What we have here is the illegal possession, interstate transportation of an unregistered shotgun with a barrel less than 18 inches in length or an overall length of less than 26 inches. He held up the shotgun. The barrel was about 16 inches long, maybe a bit more. Registration of said weapon must be made with the U.S. Treasury and a $200 paid taxes to the Treasury. After registration, subsequent sale of said weapon must be first approved by the Department of the Treasury and will be subject to a $200 tax payable to the Treasury by the seller each time the weapon changes hands. Agent Turner was grinning like a Cheshire cat. So unless either Mr. Miller or Mr. Layton here can produce registration papers for this weapon, I'd say we've got ourselves a couple of federal criminals. Miller, a poor man with little formal education, had jerked as if jolted with electricity at the mention of the dollar figure. You mean I gotta pay $200 to you federal men if and I decide to sell that $5 shotgun to my friend here? The concept was beyond his comprehension. Agent Turner smiled patiently. That would be true, Mr. Miller, if you or your friend had already paid $200 to the Treasury in 1934 when the law was passed, and registered this gun with us at that time. Since you did not, you and Mr. Layton are guilty of illegal possession and interstate transport of an unregistered weapon controlled by the National Firearms Act of 1934, and you are each therefore subject to a fine of $5,000 and a prison sentence of 5 years. Now turn around and cross your wrists behind your back. Miller's jaw dropped in disbelief, but he did as he was told. Agent Turner took the chromed steel handcuffs from the case on his belt and locked them around Jack Miller's wrist. Go get in the front of the truck, he commanded. Miller obeyed. You going to cuff the other one, he asked his partner. Agent Anderson cuffed Layton and pushed him towards the truck. Then he stared at his young partner and grabbed him by the shoulder. What the fuck kind of crazy make-up horseshit story did you just tell those peckerheads? You expect them to believe that they're going to go to prison for 5 years because the barrel on a shotgun is 1.5 inches shorter than you say it should be? Anderson spoke in a coarse whisper, his mouth only inches from his partner's ear. The chief will have our balls for making a false arrest. Special Agent Turner continued to smile as he shook his head patiently. Not what I say it should be. What the federal government says it should be. No horse shit at all. It's federal law, and now we've got our collar. Come on, he said soothingly. Let's see if this old rattletrap can make it back to our car. He started walking towards the vehicle. The older agent followed him slowly, shaking his head in disbelief and disgust. Prohibition had been crazy enough, but this? 5 years in prison because a piece of steel was 2 inches too short? He hated this job now more than ever. Anderson's final words were lost as Turner ground the starter and the tired engine coughed to life. I'd as sooner gut shot the fuckers and left them for the buzzards. September 8th, 1938. Bud, come here. Come in right now. I don't believe this. You've got to see it. The woman's face was a mixture of amazement and delight. Her husband, a lean, strong man of 32, heard the urgency in her voice immediately and came trotting over from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He started to speak. But as he reached the doorway, he saw what had so astonished his wife. He was walking, only 8 months old, and Raymond was walking. Bud put his arm around his wife's waist and hugged her to him. His smile was as broad as it had been when he had seen his son for the first time 28 weeks before. I don't believe it, he whispered, shaking his head slowly. Raymond was taking small, careful steps. His arms were held out for balance, and he was looking towards the floor. He was oblivious to the presence of his parents. All of a sudden, he lost his balance and his knees buckled. The baby sat down abruptly on the thin carpet. His mother gasped and started towards him, but her husband held her back. Wait, let's see what he does. The child inhaled, and for a moment his parents thought he was going to cry. But Raymond's eyes were alert, and he looked at his immediate surroundings. He focused on the overstuffed armchair 2 feet from him and crawled to it. With awkward but purposeful movements, the little boy clutched the fabric of the chair in his fingers and used it to steady himself as he pushed himself to a standing position again. Slowly, one hand at a time, he let go of the chair and took 2 wobbling steps. He stopped, holding his arms out like a tightrope walker, and stayed on his feet. He turned his head and saw his father, and an enormous grin filled his face. He made a loud, happy noise and started to lose his balance again. Emmett Bud Johnson could not help himself. He grabbed his little boy under the arms as he started to fall, threw him up in the air, caught him, and hugged the small body to his chest. Look who can walk! Look who got tired of crawling already! Is it time to get you a little pair of boots? Is it time to give you a little pitchfork so you can help with the horses? Are you going to help us out at rodeo time? He tossed the little boy in the air again, and Raymond's smile got even bigger. Louise always felt her heart in her chest when Bud did that, but she had long ago given up on trying to get her husband to stop throwing his son in the air. Raymond obviously loved it, and Bud insisted with a straight face that it would help their child have better balance and prevent him from being afraid of things that he shouldn't be afraid of, as her husband had explained it. Maybe he had been right. She was still marveling at the fact of her little boy taking his first steps. Bud and Louise Johnson had been married for 9 years, and they had been trying to have a child ever since their wedding night. Louise had suffered 3 miscarriages in that time, and her doctor had told her that her body was not built for having children. He told her that childbirth, if she were able to carry a pregnancy to term, might well kill her. She had been adamant and had forbidden the doctor to tell her husband of his fears. When Raymond was born, there had been severe complications, and the doctor had had to perform a cesarean section. Bud had been frightened out of his mind that his wife would die. Raymond had been healthy, if small, but Louise would not have any more children. That reality had ground on her for the last 7 months. She had come from a large family and always expected to have one herself. Bud put Raymond down next to the armchair where the little boy could hold on to it for balance. He turned to his wife and hugged her to him. Honey, I know we wanted a girl too, but I'm beginning to think that this little fellow might be about all that just the 2 of us can handle. Louise's eyes brimmed with tears. For 7 months she had feared that Bud was unhappy with the prospect of always having only one child. I have a feeling this one's going to amount to a lot more than just a cowpuncher. Louise looked up at her husband in amazement. She had never heard him run himself down before. He saw her expression and smiled before explaining. I don't mean anything bad. There isn't a place I'd rather live or a life I'd rather lead, and you know that. I'm just lucky. Our kind of life suits me as well as it does, because you and I both know it was a stretch for me to get through high school. This one here, he said, nodding at Raymond. You can see it in his face. He's smart. He wants to do things. I could see that as soon as you got home from the hospital. And that's not just a proud daddy puffing up his chest. I've seen other babies too. Raymond got a double helping of something pretty strong. He's going to have the chance to be things we've never even dreamed of. There was obvious pride in his voice. Louise nodded. She had seen it. But she had assumed that every new mother felt that way about her firstborn. She glanced at her husband, who had a pensive look on his face. Better get used to the idea of not getting to see him grow up all the way. What? She turned to face her husband, a horrified look on her face. He saw her alarm and quickly explained. I just mean that I think our Pitkin County schools are going to take him only so far. I think he's going to outgrow them, and if I'm right, we're going to make sure he goes someplace where the teachers are smarter than he is. But he's only 8 months old, Louise protested, laughing. Yet even as she said the words, Louise found herself inwardly agreeing with Bud's surprising declaration. He'll be 15 before you know it. Hell, woman. Seems like yesterday I was trying to put my hand up your dress for the first time. Louise flushed scarlet. Emmett Johnson, she squealed. She always used his given name whenever he said something shocking that nonetheless pleased her. His fingers went to the buttons of her blouse. Raymond's got himself occupied learning how to walk. Let's us go practice something of our own. But just this morning we already... Her voice trailed off at the touch of his fingertips. That's right, darling. I want to make damn sure I don't forget how. Like I told you, I never was much for brains. It'd be a real shame if I went a little too long and all the things that you like me to do just kind of slipped my mind. We'd best get some practice in so's your thick-headed husband doesn't disappoint you some night when you're feeling frisky. He scooped her up easily and carried her over to the big couch. She breathed. You're right. We don't want that to happen. She glanced over at the little boy. Raymond was using the chair again so that he could stand up. Louise closed her eyes and moaned softly. Her husband, Bud, was accomplishing something entirely different. November 9th, 1938. One moment the watch repair shop in Bergerstrasse was quiet and peaceful, occupied only by its owner. An instant later, the storefront window vanished, imploding inward in a shower of glass shards under the force of three expertly wielded truncheons. Before the jagged pieces had all come to rest on the drab but immaculate shop floor, the watchmaker knew. He knew that the whispers he had been pretending didn't exist were true. He knew that the hope he had held out had been utter self-deception. He knew that however bad things were going to be tonight, they would get much worse in the days and months to come. He had talked, oh, how endlessly he had talked, to the other Munich shopkeepers and merchants in the area. They had all agreed that it was nothing to worry about. The sentiments that were building were nothing new. Hadn't they always been resented for their business skills? Hadn't they always succeeded in commerce, and part of that success meant accepting hostility? They had agreed to do nothing, for taking action might bring them harm. That was what they had all agreed, and the watchmaker now saw with absolute clarity the fate to which they had consigned themselves. "Schnell!" came the harsh voices of the three uniformed men stepping over the windowsill into his shop. "Filthy Jewish swine! Get over here, you are under arrest." The man did not protest. He knew it would only enrage these animals further. He knew that any resistance would be an excuse to use their truncheons on his old bones, and he doubted that his body would hold up any better than his storefront window had. He knew that the only thing to do was to go along and pray for the best. He thought of his favorite nephew, Irwin Mann, who lived in Danzig and sold produce and tin goods. He'd always hoped Irwin would prosper as he had. Now look who's the prosperous one, he thought bitterly. He did not know that in 4 years his nephew would be relocated to Warsaw and soon find himself faced with a similar problem. Young Irwin Mann, however, would respond in a very different manner than had his uncle. The future of his nephew and the role that the young man would play in history was only one of the many things that the watchmaker did not know. He did not know that in addition to being arrested that night, he would also be fined for damage to his own shop. He did not know that there would be 20,000 others like him arrested in the next 48 hours. He did not know that he would never again be a free man. He most certainly did not know that within a year he would weigh less than half his current 68 kilos, that most of his fingers and toes would have been lost to frostbite and gangrene, and that when he finally died of internal bleeding, he would have lived the last 7 weeks of his life as a blind man. He did not know, but would come to learn, that he would soon spend the rest of his life, all 16 months of it, in a facility not 20 kilometers northwest of his Munich watch repair shop, just outside a town on the Amper River. The town was a small one, over 500 years old, whose previous innocuous name had recently taken on a sinister air when Germans spoke of it. The watchmaker shared a fate with almost 250,000 of his countrymen and every single one of his relatives who was still in Germany as of November 9th, 1938. He was going to Dachau. January 3rd, 1939. All rise. District Court, Western District of Arkansas, Fort Smith Division is now in session. Judge Hartzell Ragon presiding. You may be seated. First case, United States versus Miller. Mr. Gutensohn? Right here, Your Honor. The defense lawyer from Fort Smith stood up. Paul Gutensohn was a smallish man with thinning black hair who wore round, wire-rimmed spectacles. His quick movements and his sharp, prominent nose gave him a slight hawk-like appearance. Your Honor, if it please the court, my clients, Mr. Miller and Mr. Layton, are guilty of no crime whatsoever. Their arrest under Section 1148 Statute 1239 is clearly in violation of their constitutional rights for two obvious reasons. First, the so-called National Firearms Act, though presented as a revenue measure, is clearly a federal attempt to usurp power reserved to the states. This should be obvious, as the so-called tax of $200 is greatly in excess of the value of the arms on which it is levied. Second, the National Firearms Act of 1934 is completely in conflict with the second article to our Constitution's Bill of Rights, to wit, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Inasmuch as both Mr. Miller and Mr. Layton are able-bodied, and between the ages of 16 and 45, they are clearly members of the militia of which the framers of our Constitution spoke. Further, Unlike the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable search and seizure, the Second Amendment makes no mention of reasonable infringements on the people's right to keep and bear arms. The article states that this right shall not be infringed, period. There is no way to interpret our government's attempts to levy a tax of $200 on any weapon which can be used to defend oneself and one's freedoms as anything other than a gross and willful infringement on the people's right to keep and bear arms. Mr. Miller and Mr. Layton are guilty of nothing more than exercising their Second Amendment rights. Indeed, the arresting agents reported that both my clients obeyed all orders given by the agents and that at no time did either of the defendants threaten either agent in any way, with or without the weapon in question. In fact, the agents both admit that the shotgun in question was found by one of the agents on the seat of Mr. Miller's unoccupied vehicle when the arrest was made. Accordingly, I have filed a demurrer challenging the sufficiency of the facts stated in the indictment to constitute a crime, and further challenging the sections under which said indictment was returned as being in contravention of the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, USCA. You have the demurrer before you, Your Honor. Guttenson sat down. District Judge Hartzell Reagan looked at the slender man and his two clients. He had read the demurrer already, and it had been a rare experience for him. He could not recall the last time that he had felt so strongly in this particular way about a case presented before him. He had seen numerous cases where the arresting officers had lied, made up charges, manufactured evidence, and beaten suspects into confessing. This case was not like that. The Treasury agents who had arrested the two men had behaved properly in every possible way. Their arrest procedures had been straight out of the textbook. The problem with this case was why the two men had been arrested in the first place. Judge Reagan knew that the reason the Treasury agents had followed the defendants was to catch them making liquor without a license. He also knew that due to bad luck, there hadn't been any moonshine to be found when the agents had sprung the trap. But the agents hadn't let the men go. No, the agents had acted in a reasonable and prudent manner when they had arrested Miller and Layton for being in clear violation of a federal statute. The problem with this case was that defense counsel was exactly right. The federal statute, the National Firearms Act of 1934, was absolutely and unquestionably in violation of the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Judge Hartzell Reagan paused a moment to reflect on the men in the federal legislature who had created this piece of legal garbage. What kind of person would propose that a man be put in prison for 5 years based on the length of the weapon he carried to protect himself? What kind of person would expect the man to pay 20 times the value of the weapon to the Treasury for each such weapon he owned to avoid going to prison, and then pay the $200 again when he sold the gun? What kind of legislature had agreed to this insanity? The law was even worse than this case would indicate, the judge reflected. He had taken the time to read all the provisions of the 1934 statute. And Judge Reagan had been amazed at what he had seen. In addition to throwing people in prison if they didn't pay $200 taxes on $10 guns, the National Firearms Act put people in prison if they failed to pay $200 taxes on $3 sound mufflers. This was a cruel addition to an already terrible law. Judge Reagan had spent his adult life studying the law and had not fired a gun since his service in the war with Spain in 1898. But that was not the case with his three brothers. All three of the now middle-aged men had fired guns their whole lives, and all three were now almost completely deaf, and there was nothing that any doctor could do about it. What was next, wondered the judge? $200 taxes on knives? Judge Reagan took a deep breath and looked at the U.S. District Attorney C.R. Berry. Mr. District Attorney? Your Honor, the National Firearms Act of 1934 is not in any way in contravention with our U.S. Constitution. The defendants were found transporting a sawed-off shotgun in interstate commerce. Neither defendant disputes this fact. Nowhere in the U.S. is a sawed-off shotgun of the type transported by Mr. Miller and Mr. Layton issued to members of the military. Accordingly, it is entirely reasonable that the Treasury enforce the National Firearms Act as a revenue-raising measure and demand that those who are in violation of it be sent to prison. Just as we tax liquor producers and expect those people who make illegal alcohol products to be sent to prison. The judge smiled at the DA, but it was entirely without humor. Mr. Berry, he said in a resonant voice, There is no mention made in the Constitution about making whiskey. There is a very clear mention made of the right to keep and bear arms. You may be entirely right that our government does not issue our soldiers shotguns of the exact type that Mr. Miller had in his truck. However, you are forgetting everything you were taught in grade school civics class. The DA turned crimson at this barb. The judge went on, a militia, by definition, is a group of citizens who use their own weapons for defense of themselves and their freedoms. We cannot throw them in prison or fine them $5,000 for failing to have exactly the same type of arms as are carried by the National Guard or any other branch of our standing army, or expect them to pay $200 taxes at the whim of the Treasury merely to exercise their constitutional rights. But, Your Honor, Mr. Berry, I have carefully reviewed this National Firearms Act of yours, and it imposes the same 5-year prison sentence and $5,000 fine on interstate transport of automatic weapons as well. The DA got a sick look on his face. He knew where this was going. Tell me, Mr. Berry, are you familiar with the Browning automatic rifle, the model 1918 bar? Yes, Your Honor. So am I. In fact, my son carried one in France at the very end of the Great War, a marvelous weapon, and one he could well have used at the beginning of the war, and not just the end. In fact, the bar is a weapon I wish I had when I fought in the war with Spain in 1898. And Mr. District Attorney, the Browning automatic rifle is, I believe, currently issued to U.S. soldiers and members of the Arkansas National Guard, is it not? I believe so, Your Honor. Mr. Berry, if the Treasury agents had found a bar and not a shotgun in Mr. Miller's truck, would they have arrested him for violating the National Firearms Act? I can't say what the agents would or wouldn't have done, Your Honor. I'll rephrase the question, Mr. Berry. If the agents had arrested Miller and Layton for possessing a Browning automatic rifle without having paid a $200 tax and without possessing the stamp-affixed federal order form as per this National Firearms Act, would you be prosecuting them under the National Firearms Act as you are now doing? The DA licked his lips. How the hell do I answer this one? Well, Mr. Berry, they would be in violation of the Act, so yes, I would prosecute them, Your Honor. And if I happen to have a Browning automatic rifle at my home in my bedroom, the very same type of weapon that my son carried proudly defending our country in 1918, and if this weapon in my bedroom was not stolen from a government arsenal, but rather one that I had bought with my own money from the Colt factory in 1920 so that I would be prepared to act as a member of the militia or to defend myself from an abusive government, should the need arise, and if I had brought this bar here to my Arkansas bedroom from my former residence outside the state, would you prosecute me for violating the National Firearms Act and recommend that I be thrown in prison for 5 years, Mr. District Attorney? The DA was sweating despite the cool air in the courtroom. Your Honor, I would never prosecute someone who has not been arrested. And if I were arrested, Mr. District Attorney, should I then go to prison for 5 years, pay a $5,000 fine, and be disbarred, according to you and your National Firearms Act? Your Honor, he said, holding his hands up, palms up, pleading with the judge, the Treasury agents would never arrest you. Why not? Because I'm a judge? Because I'm not a moonshiner? Mr. District Attorney, I see no exemptions in this National Firearms Act for judges or any other categories of the people to which our Bill of Rights refers. Do you? No, Your Honor, Berry said softly. I didn't think so. I believe you understand my position, Mr. District Attorney. Mr. Gutenson, he said, addressing the defense lawyer, the demurrer you filed is accordingly sustained. The National Firearms Act of 1934 violates the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. He banged his gavel once upon the bench. Case dismissed. Mr. Miller and Mr. Layton, you are free to go. Paul Gutenson stood up. His heart was racing. There was no feeling like this one. Winning a case on a technicality or insufficient evidence was one thing. This was so much better. Paul Gutenson, had seen that the law which had been applied to his clients was in fundamental violation of their rights, and he made it stick. A piece of illegal federal legislation had been struck down because of his efforts and his efforts alone. This is better than money. Hell, he thought recklessly. It's better than sex. Jack Miller and Frank Layton stood in front of him. They were wearing their best clothes, which was to say they looked a little more shabby than the people in the back of the courtroom. Miller twisted his hat in his calloused hands. He was obviously relieved at the decision, but also anxious about what he wanted to tell his lawyer. "We made it, didn't we?" Guttenson said, clapping Miller on the back with a broad grin. Jack Miller looked slightly embarrassed. "Mr. Guttenson," Miller began awkwardly, "I never did feel right about you agreeing to do all this work on your own just 'cause you thought what them federal men done wasn't right. I didn't have no money when we first talked, and you said no matter. Well, that ain't the way I ever done things." Here, he said, thrusting his hand out to the lawyer. "Probably ain't what you got coming to you, but it's all I got. It ain't been stole." Paul Guttenson took the handful of bills. He had seen this happen before. Sometimes it was $5 or $10 in one, sometimes a side of beef, a slab of bacon, or fresh veggies from a client's garden. The lawyer looked at the money and was startled to see it was six $20 bills. This is probably the most money this man has ever had in his hand at one time in his entire life, Guttenson thought. He looked up uncertainly at Miller. Jack Miller gave an embarrassed smile. "I figure it's a sight better than going to prison and having my family left with no way to get by. And it's less than what them federal men and I was supposed to give 'em back in '34 to keep my gun." Guttenson smiled and nodded once. Miller looked relieved and quickly put on his hat. "We got to go," he said quickly, and he and Frank Layton walked out of the courtroom. Paul Guttenson picked up his valise and looked around the courtroom with satisfaction. His step was light, and his pace was even quicker than usual as he walked out of the building and into the chill January air. Normally, he hated cold weather, but for some reason, it felt invigorating today. He looked up into the clear blue sky and fingered the bills in the pants pocket of his gray suit. "It's great to be alive," he thought happily. March 6th, 1939. Morning, Paul. Welcome back to our wonderful Arkansas weather. Right, I was thinking I should have stayed in Mississippi. What did I miss while I was off being the dutiful son? Did you sell our practice? I wish. No, it's been pretty quiet around here. Got one lover's quarrel late in the week. Guy belted his lady friend, cracked her jaw. Her dad's making her press charges. I'm representing Romeo if it ever gets to court. Well, what's your defense? You know, a typical shouting match that went a little too far. This is the first time it's ever happened. Your Honor, don't throw my client in the jug. He has a steady job and will, of course, make restitution, blah, blah, the usual drill. Oh, I almost forgot. Just after you left, that case you nailed just after New Year's on constitutional grounds, the feds have appealed it to the Supreme Court. I tried for almost a week to track down your buddy Jack Miller, but the guy's vanished, and no one has a clue where to find him. Same with that Frank Layton. The notice is right here, right there on top of your pile of mail. Paul Guttenson sighed as he picked up the notice of appeal. This was the last thing he wanted to hear first thing on Monday, after being out of the office for 2 weeks. He looked at the court date for the case. Thursday, March 30th, 3 weeks. He folded the document and put it back in the envelope. So what are you going to do? I don't know. Try to find out where Miller is, I guess. Although I doubt he'll be up for another round in court, especially 1,000 miles from here in D.C. I can't say as I have any burning desire to hop on a train and pay for a hotel room for Lord knows how long. Whatever Mr. Miller's desires might be, providing I can find him, I don't think paying my expenses are within his budget, to say nothing of the actual legal fees. You gonna file a brief on his behalf? Mail it to him? Paul Guttenson sighed again. This was starting to give him a headache. I don't know. I ought to, but you know the rules. The U.S. Supreme Court won't accept typed briefs. They're above all that. For them, you have to get your briefs printed. I'm not eager to pay for that out of my own pocket either. I think we're at the point where we're not going to do these charity cases anymore. He thought for a moment before continuing. I'll try to get a hold of Miller or Layton. Maybe I can convince one of them that paying for a little more of my time and effort is good insurance against having their case overturned. You think the feds have much of a shot? Guttenson shrugged. I don't think so. Reagan laid it out pretty plainly in his Western District ruling. That National Firearms Act is garbage, completely unconstitutional. I think maybe they passed it because with Prohibition gone, all those Treasury agents needed something to enforce. He chuckled to himself. You ever hear of our government laying a bunch of their own people off? His partner laughed out loud. Ever since our current president seized power, I haven't been able to keep up with the alphabet soup of three-letter government programs. And that socialist bastard will never have managed to get any of his schemes passed into law without packing the Supreme Court first. What's that they're saying now? Something like, become a Roosevelt Democrat? It beats having to find a real job. The partner's tone became more serious. To answer your question, Paul, no. I can't imagine the Treasury Department laying off three-fourths of its agents just because there isn't the Volstead Act to enforce anymore. They have to have a boogeyman to go after. I looked at your case, though. It was ironclad. I don't see how the Supreme Court could reverse, even if King George himself were Chief Justice. Paul Gutenson's partner did not know it, but he had just delivered what would prove to be the worst legal opinion of his entire career. March 30th, 1939. The Supreme Court of the United States is now in session. Chief Justice McReynolds presiding. United States versus Miller at Mr. Gordon Dean for the United States. For the appellees, Chief Justice McReynolds looked around the courtroom. No one volunteered to speak for Jack Miller or Frank Layton because no one was there on their behalf. Well then, Mr. Dean. Gordon Dean took a deep breath. He had prayed that no opposing legal counsel would show up, and when he had learned that no brief had been filed, he realized that his prayers had been answered. An opponent to challenge what he was about to say would have doomed his argument. Without opposition, there was a chance he could squeak by. All it would take was some creative manipulation of the facts and some monumental omissions. Yes, Your Honor. If it please the court, the district court's prior dismissal of this case and ruling that the National Firearms Act is in contravention to our Constitution has no rational basis in the law. The National Firearms Act levies a tax on the interstate commerce in sawed-off shotguns and affixes a federal stamp to the order as proof that the tax has been paid. Mr. Miller and Mr. Layton transported in interstate commerce a sawed-off shotgun without having in their possession a stamp-affixed written order for the firearm. That fact is not in dispute. The weapon that Miller and Layton transported in interstate commerce, a double-barrel Stevens 12-gauge shotgun, having a barrel less than 18 inches in length and bearing serial number 76230, is not issued to any military entity anywhere in our country. To say that this weapon is part of any well-regulated militia is utter nonsense. Gordon Dean knew he had just stretched the truth about as far as he ever had in his professional life. Short-barreled shotguns have been used in every military engagement in the last 50 years, but what Dean had actually said was that serial number 76230 was not government issue, so it wasn't a lie. That's what the lawyer told himself at any rate. The U.S. lawyer looked into the eyes of each of the Supreme Court justices and felt a trickle of sweat run down his spine. He was searching for any sign that one of these men had seen military service and had used a shotgun with a barrel shorter than 18 inches. If any one of them has, he's going to skin me alive, Dean thought. He pressed on. The National Firearms Act is, once again, a revenue-raising measure. It raises monies for the Treasury by levying a tax on certain weapons. Mr. Miller's right to keep and bear arms was in no way infringed. He was merely required to pay a tax on a weapon he would have committed no crime. He was merely required to pay a tax on a weapon that has no relationship whatsoever to a militia. Mr. Miller could have paid this tax, and he would have committed no crime. He could also have chosen to transport a different weapon across state lines, such as a military rifle, and again, he would have committed no crime. He failed to pay this tax and then transported the NFA-controlled weapon in interstate commerce. This is a crime, pure and simple. You have the government's brief, Your Honor. Gordon Dean held his breath. He was dreading the inevitable question about the National Firearms Act, also restricting interstate commerce in automatic military arms. He also dreaded the question of how a $200 tax on a $10 gun could be anything but an infringement on the right to keep the weapon. As he stood there in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, he could not help but think about the purpose of the second article in the Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment is a recognition of the danger of standing armies. Its purpose is to recognize that every citizen has the right to keep and bear the same type of basic arms as a soldier in a modern military. A militia embodies all able-bodied men over the age of 16. Therefore, a militia will always outnumber a standing army by at least 20 to 1. If this militia is armed with weapons similar to those used by the individuals comprising the standing army, it will be impossible for that standing army to inflict the will of a tyrannical government upon the people. The Second Amendment is the guarantee behind all the other articles in the Bill of Rights. It is the ultimate guarantee that citizens of the United States will remain free. Gordon Dean waited for the justices to look at the wording of the National Firearms Act and ask him, based on his own arguments, how the act could restrict private commerce in not only Stevens shotgun serial number 76230, but also the exact weapons currently issued to infantrymen in our military. I'm not cut out for lying to the Supreme Court. This isn't what I had in mind when I went to law school, he thought. Thank God there's no opposing counsel to bring out the truth. He was beginning to feel physically ill. The question from the judges never came. May 15th, 1939. World events were coming to a head. The Munich conference had been held 8 months earlier, and British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had made his famous claim of having secured peace in our time by acceding to Hitler's demand to occupy western Czechoslovakia with German troops. Although most Americans did not even know how to spell Czechoslovakia, let alone care what happened between it and Germany, in 3.5 months the little man with the toothbrush mustache would start the invasion of Poland. America would soon agree with Winston Churchill's assessment of the seriousness of the Axis threat. Those national sentiments were months in the future on this Monday in May. However, on this spring morning the Supreme Court would issue a ruling that virtually no one at the time would notice. Further, the ultimate results of the decision would not fully be felt by U.S. citizens for many decades. The court had spent considerable time reviewing the government's brief in the case. It was not often that a district court ruled that a federal law was unconstitutional. It was even rarer that one of the participants not even show up to argue its side of a Supreme Court case or file a brief on behalf of the client. Still, the court considered the government's position in the fairest way that it could, without assuming any facts or statements not presented. The decision, unlike most Supreme Court decisions that would come in future years, was only 4 pages long. The reasoning behind the court's decision was contained in the second paragraph. In the absence of any evidence tending to show that possession or use of a shotgun having a barrel less than 18 inches long at this time has some reasonable relationship to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia, we cannot say that the Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear such an instrument. Certainly it is not within judicial notice that this weapon is any part of the ordinary military equipment or that its use could contribute to the common defense. Gordon Dean's straw man argument had worked. Without opposing counsel, the court was never told that shotguns with barrels of less than 18 inches were used in the military. The court was never informed that the National Firearms Act applied to automatic weapons that were obviously military issue, which would have killed the government's own argument right there. Finally, no one had pointed out, as had District Court Judge Hartzell-Reagan, that militia weapons were, by definition, the personal arms of the private citizenry, and therefore whether or not a particular weapon was issued to Army troops was completely irrelevant. The language of the decision would ultimately cause the government much trouble, however. The wording clearly showed that the Supreme Court viewed all military issue, small arms, as being constitutionally protected. Since the National Firearms Act infringed upon the citizen's right to keep and bear many obviously military issue small arms, the court should have found the act unconstitutional. But the court did not know about this element of the act, and so the National Firearms Act remained on the books as part of federal law. Jack Miller and Frank Layton, innocent men the day before, were once again guilty of a federal crime. They had no known address, however, and in 1939, tracking down a couple of poor Arkansas hillbillies because a year earlier they had a piece of steel shorter than a certain length was not top priority for Treasury agents. Jack Miller and Frank Layton were never seen again by law enforcement authorities. In 1939, few, if any, people complained about the National Firearms Act, just as few people complained about the much more obvious Jim Crow laws that existed throughout the country. Just like the doctrine of separate but equal, the National Firearms Act would remain an embarrassing stain on the nation's fabric for over half a century. Just as with that other civil rights violation, the National Firearms Act would spawn other, more outrageous infringements, like a tumor that slowly metastasizes into ever widening and ever more aggressive forms of cancer. Finally, as was true of the civil rights violations everywhere in the world, the choice would come down to eradicating the cancer or letting it kill the patient. That decision, however, would not happen for more than 50 years. When it did, it would be precipitated by several people who on that May afternoon in 1939 had not yet been born, and one who was then only 1 year old.